Okay, in this video we're going to go over object manipulation, how to use manipulation to move objects, rotate objects, and scale them. It's very fundamental in 3D to be able to do those three things. And if you can't do those three things, well, you're not going to get very far in 3D. So let's go ahead and see how to do that so we can get it out of the way. Alright, let's go ahead and create a test object to go ahead and play around with. I'm going to go to the main command panel. I'm going to click on the create panel over here. I'm going to make sure I'm in geometry mode. I'm going to go over here and click on a standard primitives, and I'm going to create a box. So I'll click on box here, and I'll just click here in the center of the grid and create a simple box. Okay, there's my simple little box. Nothing special. It's just going to show us how to move things around. Okay, now in 3ds Max we have three basic coordinates that we can use to move things around. We have the y coordinate, as you can see here, the x coordinate, and the z coordinate. And if you look in the lower left of your viewport, you'll notice you have again a little coordinate icon here. It shows you z, that goes up and down in blue. X goes, well, I guess you can say left and right in red, and forward and backward is y, which is green. Okay? Now, let's see how to manipulate objects and move them around. If I want to grab this cube and I want to move it left and right or up and down or forwards and backwards, I need to be able to manipulate it. To do that, we'll use the select and move tool. If you go up here to the main menu bar, the main toolbar, we can see we have a select and move tool, which is this little arrow icon here. So let's go ahead and left click on that, and now it's yellow and pushed in, showing us that we have the tool activated. And you'll see that now we have this manipulator over here, which is active and we can use to move the cube. So it's pretty simple to use. Simply put your mouse over the X coordinate here to make it turn yellow. Once it's highlighted in yellow, that means that you can click and drag this and move it only in the X axis. If you do the same thing with the green arrow or the Y axis, you can move this front and back, like so, along the Y axis. And you probably guessed that if we do the same thing with the Z axis or the blue arrow, we can move this up and down. Now you'll also notice that there's these sort of little icons in between the different arrows. What those do is those little icons allow us to constrain movement to two axes instead of just one. So instead of moving this just in the Z axis, we can move it in the X and the Z at the same time. Just hover your mouse over that icon until this whole quadrant here of the manipulator turns yellow, and now you can move this up and down and left and right at the same time. We can do the same thing by clicking on this icon here, which highlights the Z-axis and the Y-axis at the same time. Now we can move this up, down, forward, and backwards. You also notice that there's another icon. If we turn around and move over here, we can see it. Here's the little icon down here, the Y and X icon, which allows us to move this forwards and backwards, left and right, but we can't move it up and down. Okay? So that's how that works. Now let's look at rotation. Say we want to rotate this object. How do we do that? Well, next to the select and move tool is the select and rotate tool. So it's pretty simple. And you can see the icon here has this sort of rotation orientation to it. So click on that to activate the rotation tool. Now you notice the manipulator turns into a series of rings. We can use these rings on the manipulator to rotate this cube around. So for example, the red line here, or the red ring, represents the x-axis. So we can rotate this cube along its x-axis here. Or we can rotate along the y-axis, or the green ring. And again, the z-axis, or the blue ring. You also notice there's a ring here on the outside that's gray. Well, that ring allows you to rotate based on your camera view. So right now it's not rotating based on a single axis. It's rotating based on the angle that you're viewing it from, as you can see. Okay? We can also rotate freely by going ahead and clicking and dragging in between the rings. So if you click and drag in between the rings, the center, or the area of the rings, becomes gray, so it looks like this sort of semi-transparent sphere. And now when you click and drag, you freely rotate this on all the axes at the same time. So this is moving in the X, Y, and the Z. It's rotating on all of them at the same time. So it's kind of like a free roam rotation here. Okay? So that's rotation. What about scaling? How can we scale this thing to make it bigger or smaller, or squash it down or stretch it out? Well, it's pretty simple. Next to the select and rotate tool is the select and uniform scale tool. Well, If you notice, some of the icons up here in 3ds Max have a little tiny black tick mark or a little tiny arrow on the lower right. You can see it here in the select tool, and you can see it here in the scale tool, as well as the pivot tool over here. Okay, so what does that mean? That means if I left mouse button click on that menu item and hold down the left mouse button, a little submenu pops up. In this case, I have 3 different options for scaling. I can scale this using uniform scale or non-uniform scale, etc., etc. So let's see how these different ones work. The select and uniform scale is going to scale this thing uniformly. So if I click on this, it activates, and now I can scale this uniformly. You'll notice my manipulator is a lot different than before. Again, if I go ahead and highlight just the y-axis, I can scale this uniformly in the y-axis. I can scale this in the x-axis, or I can scale this in the z-axis and make this taller. If I go ahead and move my mouse cursor in between all the axes, they all will become highlighted in yellow like they are right now. This allows me to scale everything completely uniformly, larger or smaller. I can also move my mouse cursor in between the axes to go ahead and activate or constrain movement to just 2 axes. So for example, I can constrain the scaling to just the z and the y-axis like this. Or I can constrain the scaling to only the z and the x-axis like this. Or, you guessed it, the y and the x-axis like so. We can also activate some of the other scaling tools, such as this tool, which is a non-uniform scale. What this is going to do, it's going to allow the object to scale non-uniformly. Then we have down here the squash tool. Now this one is going to try to squash the object and keep the same volume. Basically what that means is when you try to scale this up, it's going to try to keep the same surface area or the same volume by squashing itself. So as I make this taller, the sides are going to go ahead and shrink down to compensate for the new increase in volume up here because it's taller. So you can use this to squash things and get some pretty interesting effects here and not scale this uniformly. So those are the different scaling tools. Okay. Now, the best way of using these manipulation tools is by using keyboard shortcuts. They save you a lot of time. So let's go over some of the keyboard shortcuts. Q on the keyboard is to activate the select tool, which you can see is activated here in the main toolbar, the select object tool. If I hit W on the keyboard, it'll activate the select and move tool. If I hit E on the keyboard, it activates the select and rotate tool. And if I hit R, it activates the select and scale tool, and any tool that you have up here. So if I have select, say, the scale and squash tool, that's the one that's going to become activated. If I hit R again and again and again, I can cycle through the different scaling modes. So right now I'm in uniform, right now I'm in non-uniform, and right now I'm in squash. And if I hit R again, I'll go back to uniform scaling. So those are pretty useful shortcuts that you can use to go ahead and quickly use these different and very important tools. Okay, so that's going to cover it for object manipulation and the basics of moving, rotating, and scaling objects around. So we'll pick up on the next video and continue going with 3ds Max.